22nd July 1946, a calm midsummer day in Jerusalem. The King David Hotel was buzzing with the usual activities of British officialdom in Palestine, as this building housed the central government secretariat as well as the headquarters of the British Armed Forces in Palestine. At about 12:37 p.m., the building was shattered with a horrifying blast. 91 people were killed and many more were wounded. The blast was the result of 6 bombs exploded simultaneously from inside the building by the revisionist militant group Irgun. Irgun operatives had infiltrated the hotel in the guise of waiters and planted the explosives. The blast at the King David Hotel was not just a savage act of Zionist terrorism, it was a warning to the British. The message was clear: get out and leave Palestine to us. I am Dr. Hassan Bukhari, and this is the 8th episode of our series Palestine versus Israel. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Palestine problem was no closer to a solution than in 1939. The British wanted to hold on to Palestine and thus opposed the formation of a Zionist state. Britain wanted a strong military presence in Palestine to secure its oil holdings in the Persian Gulf. With most of the Middle East getting its independence and the possibility of evacuation of the British military from Egypt looming, Palestine was deemed cardinal to British strategic interests in the Middle East. The Arabs wanted independence for all of Palestine and were prepared to ensure that the Jewish minority got its full political rights. But they wanted further immigration halted so that Palestine would receive independence with its existing population ratio, with the Arabs outnumbering the Jews 2-1. The Zionists wanted all of Palestine converted into the independent Zionist state of Israel, but were at this time amenable to accepting a partition in which they would receive the lion's share of Palestine despite being a minority as a first step towards their ultimate goal. The issue of immigration was closely tied to the political future of Palestine. The Zionists wanted to create a Jewish majority in Palestine through immigration prior to independence, and they were bent on using the plight of Jews in Europe to force Britain to accept unlimited immigration. The Arabs and the British predictably opposed this, but the Zionists had a great ally in the United States of America. Britain had been severely weakened by the Second World War and the impending loss of its Indian colony. Now, it had become dependent on American aid and also needed the USA's help in countering communism. The USA fully supported the Zionist demand regarding immigration. The USA was much concerned about Jewish refugees in Europe, but its concern didn't force it to accept those poor souls into the USA. Instead, it wanted the refugees to be sent to Palestine while knowing fully well that this could create a volatile situation over there. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin wasn't much wrong when he said that the Americans favored the admission of Jewish refugees into Palestine because they did not want too many of them in New York. Bevin's remark might have been harsh, but there was some truth to the fact that the Zionists didn't want the refugees rescued unless they were given a license to immigrate to Palestine. A Zionist aide to President Truman actually had advised the president not to accept Jewish refugees in the USA so as not to dilute the argument that an independent Jewish state was required to absorb them. According to historian Howard Sacca, Truman had been a pro-Zionist for many decades. In contrast to his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman showed immense partiality to the Zionists at the expense of his British allies and the Arabs. Truman's own sympathies for Zionism do not completely explain this behavior. After all, the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin had been an ardent Zionist supporter as well and had actively campaigned against the Parsfield Paper of 1930. In contrast to Roosevelt, a political giant, Truman appeared a mere dwarf. He needed all the support he could get, and he gravitated towards the Zionists for their political muscle as well. In March 1945, Roosevelt had concurred with the State Department that a Jewish state in Palestine could provoke the Arabs and even result in war. David Niles, Roosevelt's assistant, was probably correct when he said, "There are serious doubts in my mind that Israel would have come into being if Roosevelt had lived." But Roosevelt's death and his replacement by the politically insecure Zionist sympathizer Truman greatly altered US policy on Palestine. In August 1945, American interference in Palestine began with President Truman's request to British Prime Minister Attlee that 100,000 Jewish refugees be admitted in Palestine. Truman's request merely echoed a recent identical Zionist demand. The Zionists were aware of the fact that Britain had been quietly allowing a Jewish immigration of 18,000 every year in violation of the White Paper of 1939, which had stipulated that after 1944, immigration could only be sanctioned with the concurrence of the Arabs. The British were also aware that the demand for immigration of 100,000 Jews was just a starting point. British Foreign Secretary Bevan put it curtly. Unfortunately, from the Zionist point of view, the 100,000 is only a beginning, and the Jewish agency talks in terms of millions. The claim made by the Arabs is a very difficult one to answer. Why should an external agency, largely financed from America, determine how many people should come into Palestine and interfere with the economy of the Arabs who have been there for 2,000 years? That is what I have to face. The American pressure on Britain regarding the refugee issue resulted in the formation of a joint Anglo-American committee in 1946. The committee had a mandate to make recommendations about not only the refugee issue but also about the political future of Palestine. The Anglo-American Committee interviewed many Zionist and Arab witnesses. The Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann himself acknowledged before the committee that in asking for unlimited immigration and a Zionist state in Palestine, the Arabs would be subject to an injustice. But he further implied that this injustice was a lesser one compared to the greater injustice suffered by the Jews during World War II and for which they must be compensated. The Arab Higher Committee decried the political, economic and demographic imbalance caused by Jewish immigration in Palestine. The facts pointed to the veracity of this assessment. The Arab population had declined from 93% of the total to 65% in 1946 due to Jewish immigration under British tutelage. During the mandate, this Jewish minority had also achieved the dominant position in Palestine's economy. Not only that, but the exclusive nature of the Zionist economy ensured that the Arabs wouldn't benefit from the Zionist economic boom. After lengthy deliberations, on the 30th of April 1946, the Anglo-American Committee issued a report that was basically a compromise between the British and American wishes. It recommended the immediate entry of 100,000 Jewish refugees into Palestine, but advised that Palestine should remain under the British mandate pending the execution of a trusteeship agreement under the United Nations. This report was rejected by all parties concerned though. The Arabs rejected the recommendation for the entry of refugees. They also wanted an independent Palestinian state instead of remaining under British rule. Ben-Gurion also rejected it as it had ruled out the creation of a Zionist state. Even the British government didn't accept it. The mandatory authorities in Palestine were of the view that such a huge and immediate influx of Jewish refugees would require the deployment of an extra division costing about £40 million. On the recommendation of President Truman, a new committee was formed. It was co-chaired by Dr. Henry F. Grady, an Assistant Secretary of State, and the British Deputy PM Herbert Morrison. The Morrison-Grady Committee's proposals were made public on July 31, 1946. It recommended the admittance of 100,000 Jewish refugees in Palestine within 1 year as a one-time measure. It further proposed that the US and UK should work to resettle the bulk of the rest of the Jewish refugees in Europe itself. Regarding the political future of Palestine, the committee proposed to keep the Negev and Jerusalem areas under British administration. This was about 60% of the total area of Palestine. The remaining area was to be divided almost equally into separate Arab and Jewish provinces, with the former receiving about 23% and the latter getting about 17% of the total area of Palestine. Even in the Jewish and Arab provinces, the British High Commissioner would have authority over defense, foreign relations, customs, police, courts, and communications. He would also have the power to veto all legislation for a transitional period of 5 years. Immigration was also to be controlled by the High Commissioner after the initial influx of 100,000 Jewish refugees. After the release of the Morrison-Grady Committee report, the British invited the Arabs and Zionists to London in order to discuss the committee's proposals. The Zionists rejected the invitation and advocated for the partition of Palestine. The Arabs also rejected it and called for an independent unitary state in Palestine with an elected legislature. The Arabs offered a power-sharing agreement with the Jews, according to which 3 out of 10 ministers at all times would be Jewish, and Hebrew would be accepted as an official language in Jewish majority districts. Citizenship would only be granted to persons who had been living in Palestine for a continuous period of 10 years in order to exclude Jewish refugees from Europe. The Zionists, though, didn't want any power sharing with the Arabs and insisted on partition. President Truman, on whose advice the Morrison-Grady Committee had been formed, initially backed its recommendations, but the domestic political pressure put on him by the Zionists soon led him to make a U-turn. On October 4, 1946, he issued a statement endorsing the partition of Palestine. He had made this U-turn with an eye on the congressional elections scheduled for November 1946. But Truman was unsuccessful in attracting Zionist support. His chief political rival, Thomas Dewey of the Republican Party, loudly called for permitting several 100,000 Jews to be allowed into Palestine. The Republicans, backed by American Zionists, won 246 seats to the Democrats' 188. This defeat greatly perturbed Truman, who resolved to take a much more vivid pro-Zionist stance in the future. The Zionists did not solely rely on lobbying to create their state. They used another potent weapon to try to force the British out of Palestine: terrorism. Ben-Gurion had long been convinced that violence would be necessary for the creation of Israel. In 1946, before the Anglo-American Committee, he had declared, "We are not going to renounce our independence, even if we have to pay the supreme price. And there are hundreds of thousands of Jews, both in this country and abroad, who will give up their lives if necessary for Jewish independence, for Zion." After the World War and the end of the Nazi threat, Ben-Gurion promptly initiated the preparations for an armed campaign in Palestine. In the summer of 1945, he contacted Jewish millionaires in the USA to arrange weapons. In the autumn of 1945, the Jewish Agency officially sanctioned violence as a strategy. October 1945 saw the beginning of Zionist terrorist operations against the British. The first major Zionist terrorist operation was the result of cooperation between the Irgun and the Haganah. The British rail network was dynamited at 200 different points. 3 naval launches that were being used to intercept illegal refugee vessels were also sunk. The next month, Ben-Gurion's Haganah militia reached an agreement with the 2 Zionist terrorist organizations, the Irgun and the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang. It was decided that all future operations of the Irgun and Stern Gang would be coordinated under Haganah's direction. From then on, the 3 Zionist organizations let loose a reign of terror aimed chiefly at the British. Irgun and the Stern gang mostly took on the burden of conducting terrorist activities, whereas Haganah, with the help of Jewish units in the British military, bought and stole huge amounts of arms and munitions. Haganah also established secret munition factories and developed the capability to manufacture mines, grenades, and automatic rifles in bulk. From November 1945 to June 1946, Zionist terrorism took a heavy toll on the British. Dozens of British army and police soldiers were killed and wounded during this period. Material damage caused by terrorists was estimated at more than 4 million British pounds. On June 17, 1946, Haganah launched a very daring attack titled Operation Marcolet. Haganah operatives blew up 10 vital bridges connecting Palestine to neighboring countries. The British now had enough. They started extensive searches of Jewish settlements for arms, but these were unsuccessful more often than not. The Zionists were very adept at hiding their weapons. Once, when such a search operation was successful, a store of 600 weapons, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, and a quarter ton of explosives was discovered, spread among 33 hiding places around one Jewish village. 12 days after Operation Marcolet, the British raided the headquarters of the Jewish Agency in a bid to crush the Zionist resistance. 2,700 people were arrested, including future Israeli Prime Minister Moshe Sharaf, and a large amount of documents were taken, but the raid failed to arrest most of the Haganah leadership. Nicholas Bethel, in his book The Palestine Triangle, states that few of the British knew Hebrew, so they hired Jews to analyze the confiscated documents. But these Jews turned out to be Haganah agents who destroyed most of the incriminating material. The Zionists responded by launching one of the most famous terror attacks in Palestine's history. Menachem Begin, Irgun's leader, decided to blow up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which was a symbol of British rule in Palestine and housed the administrative and military offices of the British government in Palestine. On July 22, 1946, the King David Hotel was rocked by massive explosions. 91 people were killed and many offices with all their records were destroyed. Begin knew that the documents taken by the British during the raid on the Jewish Agency headquarters had been taken to King David Hotel, and the destruction of these incriminating documents was also a reason behind the attack. But the key aim was symbolic. The Zionists aimed to show the British public that the cost of holding on to Palestine would be made unbearable by Zionist terrorism. In December 1946, the final break of the Zionists with the British occurred as Chaim Weizmann was defeated in the election to retain his presidency of the World Zionist Congress. Weizmann was cast out because of the sole reason that his remained the only influential Zionist voice still advocating a negotiated settlement with the British. By the beginning of 1947, Zionist terrorism and Truman's U-turn on the Morrison-Grady Committee's recommendations had convinced the British that as long as Zionists were receiving immense US support, Britain wouldn't be able to deal with them effectively and prolong its rule in Palestine. Thus, in February 1947, the British government referred the Palestine problem to the United Nations. On February 25, 1947, in a speech filled with sarcasm for American support of Zionism, British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin openly denounced the Jewish call for statehood. Bevin and the Foreign Office seemed to have hoped that the United Nations would support an independent binational state under UN trusteeship, with Britain the responsible party. Zionist terrorism continued throughout the rest of 1946 and into 1947. On March 1, 1947, the Irgun blew up the Officers' Club in Jerusalem. 18 more Britishers were killed in separate attacks on the same day. On 4 May 1947, Irgun engineered a jailbreak in Acre and freed 28 imprisoned members of the Irgun and Stern gang. 9 Jewish fighters were killed during the operation and 5 were captured. Out of these 5, 2 were minors, or they might be called child soldiers, but the other 3 were tried and sentenced to death. In a desperate bid to save the 3 terrorists, Irgun kidnapped 2 British sergeants on the 12th of July and announced that they would be killed unless the British released the 3 terrorists on death row. The British didn't give in to this blackmail and executed the terrorists on the 29th of July. Consequently, the Irgun also kept its word and hanged the 2 sergeants. Their bodies were also booby-trapped in order to kill anyone who tried to cut down the bodies. In this climate of terror and alarm, the UN began its task of finding a solution to the Palestine problem. The Arabs wanted an independent Palestine with an Arab majority. The British wanted to hold on to Palestine for as long as possible under the garb of UN-mandated trusteeship, whereas the Zionists and their American patrons wanted a partition of Palestine with the lion's share of the country going to the Zionist minority. On 15 May 1947, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine was created. We will discuss the work and recommendations of this committee and the subsequent UN vote on Palestine in the next episode of Palestine versus Israel. Stay tuned, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.